Some people are really fucking stupid.
If I tell you that his jokes changed the history of stand-up, I would be understating it. George Carlin changed the history of a country itself. Humor filled with messages, social protests, and a constant struggle for freedom of expression. This is the story of, according to many, the greatest comedian in history. Before the 1960s, or rather, before George Carlin, comedy in the United States was quite restrictive, or as we would say now, family-friendly.
Just don't sit there when I'm talking.
This is not to delve into political correctness, as the concept of this word has changed its meaning over the decades. There was a great deal of censorship, including a rule of 7 words you should never say. All of this changed with the arrival of one man, George Carlin, the mastermind who, with his rebellious behavior, completely transformed an industry tamed by his own silly rules.
Nobody even tells you when you're a kid what the words are that you're supposed to avoid. You have to say them to find out which ones they are. Shit!
Arrested several times and a propagator of phrases, clips, and videos that are still being used, and we're talking about a man who was active from the 1960s until 2008. He often said things like rights don't exist because they were something invented by people. He even claimed that the commandments created by God, even those were poorly written because we forgot things like slavery. Yes, Bill Hicks mentioned similar topics, but these comments were made before the 90s. George Carlin is truly the father of contemporary humor. He was never afraid of anything and always fought for one thing: freedom of speech.
The story of George Dennis Patrick Carlin didn't start all at once at his peak. His journey in comedy dates back to his birth. Carlin was born on May 12, 1937, in New York, USA. He had a somewhat turbulent childhood. He grew up in Morningside Heights, a neighborhood in Manhattan, in a working-class family. His father, Patrick Carlin, was an advertising executive and had a knack for comedy, and his mother, Mary Berry Carlin, was a homemaker. George had a particularly close relationship with his mother, who influenced his love for comedy and language, although their family was not wealthy. We all know that the rebellion was always one of the hallmarks of this iconic comedian. However, the question arises, where does this rebellion come from? One of his first betrayals occurred at the tender age of 7. He grew up in a Catholic Irish community, and, in his own words, the only thing left of his roots was the Irish part. During his first communion, the priest told them that after completing it, they would feel different, complete, and it would be the start of a new life. He promised them that they would be at peace, or as Catholics describe it, in a state of grace. However, absolutely nothing happened. Carlin was disillusioned and felt betrayed simply because he didn't experience any divine sensation. From that moment on, a desire to oppose authority was born within him, but not in just any way. It wasn't about simply saying, "The world is corrupt, ugly, and horrible." His approach was the precision of understanding everything that encompasses this authority and doing exactly the opposite. According to his own words, authority is not something that comes from outside or can be granted to people. It should arise from within. At the age of 8, his father passed away. He was quite an impulsive person. In the HBO documentary George Carlin, The American Dream, they talked about how he was an abuser, or how his mother called him, an angel in the street and a domestic devil. Luckily for George, he didn't have to personally endure all the aggression that this caused, as he was too young to experience this in his own flesh. Without that terrifying authoritarian figure during Carlin's childhood, he was able to connect more strongly with that rebellious side that was born within him. From that age, he showed an inclination towards rebellion and satire. He often got into trouble at school, which eventually led to his expulsion. And of course, this kind of behavior had a cost. His mother wanted to make him someone important, someone worthwhile, but this didn't fit with George's anti-authoritarian principles. Over time, they drifted apart and separated completely. After dropping out of high school, Carlin joined the United States Air Force in 1954. During those years, he worked as a DJ, where he gained incredible popularity. They thought he was an obedient and practical man who could be productive, but he clearly rebelled and began to transgress, disrespecting officers, sleeping where he shouldn't, and avoiding orders. After his service in the Air Force, George Carlin returned to New York and began his career in the entertainment world. Initially, he worked as a radio announcer and occasionally performed in nightclubs as a comedian. During those years, he met Jack Burns, with whom he got along very well and became good friends. His early years in comedy were characterized by a more conventional style, focused on entertainment humor.
Columbus did one of the most daring things yet known to man. He borrowed money from a woman.
However, George was fortunate to be born at the right time. and meet the right people. And we're not talking about opportunities, but about how those influences shaped his great sense of humor. However, thanks to Burns, he began to change and think a little differently. This duo worked quite well for them to further unite in their rebellious instincts, delving into that sarcastic humor that had been absent in the world of stand-up comedy in the United States. This style, in turn, had been influenced by the legendary Lenny Bruce. It was a shift in comedy, where the comedian went from simply telling jokes to expressing their point of view, gaining a bit more freedom. Although he was still somewhat attached to the classic approach of making jokes, his television debut on Merv Griffin's show and his monologue about Native Americans marked a turning point in his career, where he mocked the portrayal of Native Americans in Western movies.
All right, all the tall guys over by the trees. Fat guys down behind the rocks. You with the beads, out of line, come on.
Gradually, his approach evolved, and criticism and mockery became central to his comedy. During that time, his performances began to explore current affairs, parodying news and events. George had a strong desire to rebel, but temporarily set it aside as he sought fame and growth. Eventually, he began incorporating audience interaction into his jokes, harnessing cringe comedy. An example of this was when, alongside Richard Pryor, they creatively mocked the laughter of their own audience.
Well, the way it happened was, first Richard had a heart attack, then I had a heart attack, then Richard burned himself up, then I said, fuck that, I'm gonna have another heart attack.
However, in the 1960s, his inclinations towards social criticism began to emerge. During his performances, he imitated an extremely drugged hippie while reporting the weather.
Let's take a look at the national weather map.
He did it so effectively that executives didn't even notice it, although the audience did.
There it is, man.
It was at this moment that his need to rebel against the norms presented itself as the faint flutter that years later causes a tornado. There is still a long way to go for that, as by that time he had reached the peak of his popularity up to that point, becoming a celebrity in the world of comedy, a significant actor, someone who put on very well executed shows. He appeared in a suit and tie, like a wealthy man, with a simple and smiling sense of humor. During these years, his first marriage took place, and he married Brenda Hosbrook, with whom they had a little daughter named Kelly in 1961. But unfortunately, in 1997, Brenda passed away from cancer. Sometime later, he married his second wife, Sally Wade, to whom he was married until his death. George and Sally, in his own words, experienced love at first sight. But this happens much later. However, during that decade, he felt like a puppet, a marionette in this well-dressed, controlling world, which made him feel incomplete, empty, and worst of all, obedient, like a pet. It lasted until the Vietnam War began, with the rise of liberalism and, most significantly, the influence of drugs, when George began to approach comedy in a more defiant, critical, and fearless manner. During that time, he was experimenting a lot with mescaline, a hallucinogenic substance that helped him see things from a different perspective, much like Aldous Huxley describes in The Doors of Perception. Thanks to this context, he began to analyze things more deeply. Society was going through a period of oppression, and people were starting to rebel constantly. It was a time of change, and George saw this as a catalyst for his creativity. However, despite the changing society, it was still influenced by marketing campaigns that portrayed war as something positive.
Your man in Vietnam, James Daly, Specialist 6, United States Army.
His early shows in which he spoke out against the war and mentioned Muhammad Ali generated hatred, and finally, he was fired for refusing to participate. Carlin transformed into a champion of the counterculture and began addressing more controversial social and political issues in his comedy. His style became more provocative and critical, challenging the conventions of submissive comedy and commercialism. Of course, this led to multiple controversies, such as when he uttered the word shit on television, defying the norm of the 7 dirty words you can't say on television. But it was precisely an incident in Las Vegas that led him to fight against that law and use it as part of his comedy. In fact, this was one of the most iconic moments of his career, the famous 7 dirty words monologue.
Shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits. Now that was the original list. We've added a few words since then. We've added fart, turd, and twat.
This monologue, which explored hypocrisy and morality in society, led to a significant legal case about freedom of speech in broadcasting in 1978. In the monologue, Carlin used language considered inappropriate for broadcast, which led to his arrest. Although the case against him was dismissed, the controversy it generated contributed to expanding the boundaries of comedy and freedom of speech in the media. Gradually, George was approaching becoming an icon. His performances were increasingly unrestrained, brimming with irreverence, and he found an audience that appreciated his sense of humor. He mocked laws and norms and attracted a young generation yearning for change. As an adult with a young mindset, he connected with people. He abandoned suits and ties, let his beard and hair grow, and became a much more relaxed man. He revisited his jokes about drugs, hippies, irony, and even made fun of who he used to be when he worked on television. Gradually, he gained confidence in his performances, starting to explore religious topics and even poking fun at his own faith. Then he ventured into social issues, which would later become his trademark. George was known for his genuine desire to convey a message and never stopped doing so. He sought to combine his need to challenge authority in his comedy, which became an experiment. His work continued to grow, his knowledge expanded, and his courage to address controversial subjects without fear liberated the audience. He helped make stand-up comedy more liberal, and just by being himself, tackled topics that were crucial in his time. He joined a rebellious generation that craved freedom and solidified himself as a counter-system thinker. He made it clear that he despised the society alienated by media words, the romanticization of war under the guise of nationalism, and expressed strong criticism of religion, politics, and education. This demonstrated his skepticism and critical approach, always seeking evidence and reasons in what was being discussed. Over time, his shows became increasingly rebellious. He fostered the social need for having an individual identity rather than acting as a part of a big hive. This philosophy stood out over the years and remains relevant today, evident in many of his compiled clips. He always made his firm opposition to obeying norms clear, even to the bitter end. However, he was also someone who sought progress and didn't want to remain stagnant in the same thinking. This attitude earned him great appreciation and respect. George Carlin's life was filled with ups and downs, but his passion for comedy and commitment to freedom of expression never wavered. His irreverent style and bravery in challenging norms made him an icon of socially conscious comedy. But everything good comes to an end. On June 22, 2008, George Carlin passed away at the age of 71 in Santa Monica, California, due to a heart attack.
Here's another thing they say after a death. This is usually said to the surviving spouse. I'm keeping him in my thoughts. Where? Where exactly in your thoughts does he fit? In between my ass hurts in this chair and let's fuck the waitress?
His death marked the end of an exceptional comedic career and left a void in the world of entertainment. Despite his departure, his legacy endures and continues to influence comedy and the fight for freedom of expression worldwide. George Carlin, with his sharp wit and courage to question norms, left an indelible mark on comedy and popular culture. His legacy lives on through his recordings, writings, and his influence on generations of comedians who came after him. Through his work, George Carlin continues to inspire people to question, reflect, and laugh at life and society. Today, even 15 years after his passing, the image of George Carlin remains alive in everyone's memory. And what's even more important, his words endure. As the saying goes, he who is remembered never truly dies. Carlin remains present in our days because his message remains relevant. Many of his videos have become valuable resources for those who wish to discuss the ideals of freedom of expression. If you want to address this topic with someone instead of starting a conversation, all you need to do is to play a George's video. This legacy is something wonderful, but it also has its imperfections. It's positive that George's memory endures to this day, but it's not as pleasant when some people use his words to project what thoughts he would have today. Some claim that Carlin would be anti-woke and opposed to today's censorship. While this has some connection to his beliefs, ultimately, it's an appropriation of his principles and ideals to support their own opinions. But these cases are exceptions. In general, people have a deep respect for Carlin's figure and the words he left us. He has been a source of inspiration for great comedians, both his contemporaries and contemporary comedians. Kamau Bell, for example, admires him for teaching that the comedian determines the stage, not the audience. Judy Gold sees in him an example of authenticity, a genuine person. For Bill Burr, Carlin represents someone who wasn't afraid to say anything, regardless of the consequences. This legacy has even transcended the borders, influencing people who don't speak English. George Carlin transformed comedy as we know it and taught us to be more authentic. Not only was he a funny comedian, he was a star who knew how to excel anywhere he was placed. He was a person with his own problems, but he had a worldview that was needed in comedy. He managed to break free from the chains and become someone free to speak about what needs to be said, not just what needs to be heard. That's why George Carlin is one of the greatest comedians in history.